The desert wind carved through the canyon like a blade, carrying with it the scent of sage and something else. Something that made Sarah's stomach clench with a hunger so fierce it felt like dying from the inside out. She pressed her back against the red sandstone wall, her dress hanging loose on a frame that had once filled it properly. 3 months ago, she'd been the schoolteacher in Tucson, Arizona Territory, with soft hands and a future. Now she weighed less than the leather saddlebags that had been stolen along with everything else she owned. The Apache raids had come like summer lightning, sudden, devastating, and leaving nothing but ash in their wake. The wagon train she'd joined heading west had been scattered to the four winds, and she'd been running ever since. Running from memories of screams cut short, from the sight of families torn apart, from the knowledge that she was utterly, completely alone in a land that wanted her dead. Her fingers traced the sharp edges of her hip bones through the faded blue fabric. When had she become this hollow thing? When had her body started consuming itself just to keep her heart beating one more day? The mirror in her last safe haven, a burned-out trading post, had shown her a stranger with sunken cheeks and eyes too large for her face. Water was 3 days behind her now, maybe 4. Time moved differently when you were dying by degrees. The small creek she'd found had been fouled by something upstream, and she'd learned the hard way that bad water was worse than no water at all. Her lips were cracked maps of pain, and when she tried to swallow, it felt like grinding glass. But it wasn't the thirst that would kill her first. It was the emptiness, the way her body had started to eat itself from the inside out. She'd tried everything. Bark that made her violently sick, berries that burned her mouth, roots that tasted like dirt, and did nothing to fill the aching void in her belly. Yesterday, she'd seriously considered eating her own leather belt before realizing she didn't have the strength to chew it. The sun was setting now, painting the canyon walls the color of dried blood. Soon it would be cold, and she'd have to choose between moving to stay warm or conserving what little energy she had left. These were the calculations of the dying. How many steps until collapse? How many breaths until the next one became impossible? She closed her eyes and tried to remember her mother's kitchen in Ohio, the smell of bread rising, the way steam would fog the windows on baking day. But even memories had weight now, and she couldn't afford to carry them. Everything had to go: hope, dreams, the person she used to be. All of it sacrificed to the simple animal need to survive one more hour. A sound made her eyes snap open. Hoofbeats, but wrong somehow, uneven, labored. She pressed herself deeper into the shadow of the rock, knowing that discovery meant death, but lacking the strength to run. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a bird trying to escape a cage. The horse appeared first, a paint mare with foam on her flanks and exhaustion in every line of her body. The rider slumped forward in the saddle, one arm pressed tight against his side, dark stains spreading across his buckskin shirt. Apache, she realized with a jolt of terror that cut through even her hunger. The enemy, the nightmare that had destroyed everything she'd ever known. But as he slid from the horse and nearly collapsed, she saw something that stopped her breath. He was hurt, badly. And he was alone, just as alone as she was in this vast, uncaring wilderness. Blood seeped between his fingers where he pressed his hand to his side, and his face was grey with pain and blood loss. For a moment that stretched like eternity, they stared at each other across the dying light. Predator and prey, enemy and enemy, two broken things in a broken land. She waited for him to reach for his knife, for the violence that had defined every encounter between their peoples. Instead, he spoke a single word in English, his voice rough as desert stone. Water? The question hung between them like a bridge neither dared to cross. She had no water to give, and he was everything she'd been taught to fear. But something in his eyes, not pleading exactly, but a recognition of shared desperation, made her shake her head slowly. None, she whispered, her voice barely more than breath. He nodded as if he'd expected as much, then did something that changed everything. He reached into his saddlebags and pulled out a small leather pouch, holding it toward her with shaking hands. Even from where she crouched, she could smell it. Dried meat, precious and life-giving. "Eat," he said, and collapsed. The pouch landed in the dust between them, and Sarah stared at it as if it might disappear. Food. Real food. Enough to keep her alive for days, offered by the very person she'd been taught to see as a monster. Her hands shook as she reached for it, every instinct screaming warnings, even as her body cried out for salvation. She tore into the dried meat with desperate fingers, barely chewing before swallowing, her stomach cramping with the sudden presence of actual nourishment. It was like being brought back from the dead, like feeling her soul return to her body one bite at a time. Only when the worst of the hunger had been blunted did she look up to find the Apache watching her with dark eyes that held no judgment, only understanding. "Why?" she managed to ask around another mouthful. He was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his English was careful but clear. Same hunger, same empty. It was then she noticed how thin he was beneath the buckskin, how his cheekbones stood out sharp as knife blades. He was starving too, had been starving, and he'd given her his food anyway. The realization hit her like a physical blow. "You need this more than I do," she said, trying to hand back the pouch. He shook his head, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "Already dead. You... maybe not." The wound in his side was worse than she'd thought. In the growing darkness, she could see how much blood he'd lost, how his breathing had become shallow and labored. He was right. He was dying. And he'd chosen to spend his last act of strength feeding a stranger. "What's your name?" she asked softly. "Nalnish," he said, then seemed to consider. "White name. Daniel. Daniel Crow Feather." "Sarah," she replied. "Sarah Mitchell." They sat in silence as the stars emerged overhead, two enemies who had found something beyond enmity in their shared desperation. The desert night was coming, bringing with it the cold that could kill as surely as hunger or thirst. Sarah looked at the dying man who had saved her life and made a decision that would have seemed impossible just hours before. She moved closer, close enough to see the pain etched in every line of his face. "Let me help you." His eyes widened slightly. "Why?" It was her turn to be quiet, to search for words that could explain the inexplicable. "Same empty," she said finally, using his own words. "Same alone." Using strips torn from her already tattered dress, she did what she could for his wound, knowing it was probably too little, too late. But it was something. And in this place where death waited around every corner, something was everything. As she worked, he told her about the cavalry patrol that had found his small band, about the running fight that had scattered his people to the winds. His voice was growing weaker, but there was something he needed her to understand. "Not all Apache raid," he said. "Some just trying to live, like you." She nodded, thinking of all the stories she'd heard, all the fear and hatred that had been fed to her like poison. How much of it was true? How much was just the convenient lie that made killing easier? "The soldiers," she said, "they're still out there." "Maybe. Probably." His breathing was becoming more labored. "You need to be careful." The irony wasn't lost on her. Here was an Apache warrior, using his dying breath to warn her about the very soldiers who were supposed to be her salvation. The world had turned upside down, and she was no longer sure which way was up. "Daniel," she said, testing the name. It felt strange on her tongue, humanizing someone she'd been taught to see as less than human. "Sarah," he replied, and somehow her name sounded different in his voice. Not the name of an enemy, but simply the name of another person trying to survive in an impossible world. The temperature was dropping fast now, and she could see him shivering despite the fever that was beginning to burn in his eyes. She gathered what little dry wood she could find and built a small fire using the last of her matches. The flames danced between them, casting shifting shadows on the canyon walls. "Tell me about your people," she said, settling beside the fire. If these were to be his last hours, she wanted to understand who he really was, beyond the stories and the fear. He spoke slowly, his voice growing softer with each word, about a way of life that was disappearing like smoke on the wind, about children who would never learn the old songs, about sacred places that were being carved up and sold to strangers, about a people caught between worlds, belonging fully to neither. "We were free once," he said, staring into the flames. "Free to follow the seasons, to live as our fathers lived. Now," he gestured weakly at the vast emptiness around them, "now we are ghosts haunting our own land." Sarah found herself crying, though she couldn't say exactly why. Maybe it was the hunger finally being fed. Maybe it was the exhaustion of months of running, or maybe it was simply the recognition of shared humanity in the most unlikely place. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "For what?" For all of it. For the hatred. For not seeing. He reached out with his good hand and touched her arm gently. "You see now, that is enough." The fire burned lower, and with it, his strength seemed to ebb. She could see him fighting to stay conscious, fighting to hold on to whatever it was that kept a person tethered to the world. "Sarah," he said suddenly, his voice urgent despite its weakness, "I'm here. If I don't see morning—" He paused, gathering strength. "Take my horse. Take what supplies are left. Head north to the trading post at Canyon de Shelley. Tell them Daniel Crowfeather sent you." "Don't talk like that," she said, though they both knew the truth. "Listen," he insisted. "Tell them you are my wife." The words hit her like a physical blow. "What?" "Only way they will help you. White woman alone. Dangerous. But wife of Apache, even dead Apache. They will respect that. They will help." She stared at him in shock. "I can't. I don't understand." "My name," he said simply. "I give you my name. Sarah Crowfeather. It will protect you." The magnitude of what he was offering struck her speechless. In a world where names carried weight, where identity was everything, he was giving her his. A dying man's last gift to a stranger, not just food or shelter but belonging, a place in the world when she had none. "Why would you do this?" she asked, her voice breaking. "Because," he said, and his smile was sad and beautiful and heartbreaking, "because you fed me too." She looked at him in confusion. "I didn't give you anything. You gave me your name. You gave me, not enemy. You gave me person." His eyes were growing heavy, but he fought to keep them open. "That is food too. Food for spirit." The fire crackled between them, and Sarah understood that she was witnessing something sacred. Not the death of an enemy, but the passing of a friend. Someone who had seen her at her lowest point and chosen compassion over conquest. "Tell me about your family," she said softly. His face brightened slightly. "Sister, Ayana, means eternal blossom. She was, teacher too, like you. Taught children the old stories." His voice grew distant. "Maybe she is safe. Maybe she found the others." "I hope so," Sarah said, and meant it. "And you? Family?" "All gone," she said simply. "Parents died of fever 2 years ago. No brothers or sisters. That's why I came west. Nothing left in Ohio but memories. Then we are both orphans," he said. "Both alone." "Not alone," she corrected gently. "Not anymore." He smiled at that, and for a moment the pain seemed to leave his face. "No, not alone." They talked through the night, sharing stories of their different worlds, finding common ground in the most unexpected places. He told her about the changing seasons in the high country, about the way morning mist looked rising from hidden valleys. She told him about her students back in Ohio, about the way their faces would light up when they finally understood a difficult lesson, As dawn approached, his breathing became more labored, and she knew their time was running short. The eastern sky was beginning to lighten, painting the canyon walls in soft pastels that seemed too beautiful for such a moment. "Sarah," he whispered. "Yes? Promise me something. Anything. When you get to safety. When you find your new life. Remember that we were friends. Remember that Apache and White can choose different paths." "I promise," she said, tears streaming down her face. "And remember, you are Sarah Crowfeather now. That name, it means something. It means you belong somewhere." He closed his eyes then, and for a terrifying moment she thought he was gone. But his chest still rose and fell, shallow but steady. She sat beside him as the sun climbed higher, watching over his sleep, this stranger who had become the most important person in her world. When he woke again, the sun was high overhead, and she could see the fever burning bright in his eyes. He was weaker now, much weaker, but there was something he still needed to say. "The horse," he managed. "Her name is Ayana, like my sister. She will take care of you." Sarah looked at the paint mare, who had stood patiently through the night despite her own exhaustion. The horse seemed to understand that something momentous was happening, and she nickered softly when Sarah approached. "She's beautiful," Sarah said, running her hand along the mare's neck. "She knows the way," Daniel whispered, "to the trading post, to safety. Trust her." The afternoon stretched long and hot, and Sarah did what she could to make him comfortable. She gave him water from the small amount she'd found in his saddlebags, and she told him stories to distract him from the pain. Stories about her students, about the books she'd read, about the dreams she'd had before the world turned upside down. As the sun began to set again, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Daniel opened his eyes one last time. "Sarah," he said, his voice barely audible, "I'm here. Thank you." "For what?" "For seeing me. For letting me be human." She took his hand, surprised by how cold it had become. "Thank you for saving my life." "We saved each other," he said, and then he was gone. She sat with him as the stars came out, this man who had changed everything she thought she knew about the world. Tomorrow she would have to leave him here, would have to take his horse and his name, and try to build a new life from the ashes of the old one. But tonight she would keep vigil, would honor the friendship that had bloomed in the most impossible circumstances. When morning came, she buried him as best she could with stones from the canyon floor, marking the grave with a simple cross made from pieces of dead wood. It wasn't much, but it was what she could do. "Goodbye, Daniel Crowfeather," she said to the wind. "Thank you for giving me your name. I'll try to be worthy of it." She mounted Ayana with hands that shook only slightly and turned the mare's head north toward Canyon de Chelly, toward a future she couldn't imagine, carrying a name that wasn't hers, but somehow fit better than the one she'd been born with. As they rode away from the canyon, she felt something she hadn't felt in months: hope. Not just for survival, but for something more. For the possibility that in a world torn apart by hatred and fear, two people could still choose to see each other's humanity. She was Sarah Crowfeather now, and that meant something. It meant she belonged somewhere, even if that somewhere was just the space between one heartbeat and the next, the choice between compassion and cruelty, the decision to feed a stranger even when you're starving yourself. The desert stretched endlessly ahead, but she was no longer afraid. She had food, water, and a horse that knew the way. More importantly, she had a story to tell, a truth to carry forward about the possibility of friendship in the most unlikely places. The sun climbed higher, and Ayana's steady gait carried them toward whatever came next. The trading post at Canyon de Chelly rose from the red earth like a mirage made real, its adobe walls weathered by countless seasons, but still standing strong against the desert wind. Sarah's heart hammered as she approached, Daniel's words echoing in her mind, "Tell them you are my wife." The weight of his name felt heavier than the dust on her clothes, more precious than the water in her canteen. Ayana seemed to recognize the place, her ears pricking forward as familiar scents reached her. The mare had been Sarah's salvation these past 3 days, finding water where Sarah would have seen only rock, choosing paths that avoided the worst of the desert heat. It was as if Daniel's spirit guided them still, his knowledge of the land flowing through the horse he'd loved. A man emerged from the trading post as they approached, weathered and lean, with the kind of eyes that had seen too much but still held kindness. His gaze took in Sarah's condition, the Apache horse beneath her, the way she carried herself like someone who had learned to expect the worst but hope for something better. "Ma'am," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "Name's Tom Brennan. This is my place." Sarah dismounted slowly, her legs unsteady after days in the saddle. This was the moment that would determine everything, whether Daniel's gift would protect her or whether she'd find herself alone again in a hostile world. "My name is Sarah Crowfeather," she said, the words feeling both foreign and right on her tongue. My husband Daniel sent me here before he—" She let the words trail off, unable to finish. Tom's expression changed immediately, a mixture of surprise and something deeper, respect, perhaps, or recognition. "Daniel Crowfeather? The Apache who used to trade here?" "Yes," Sarah whispered. "I heard there was trouble with the cavalry." "Daniel—" She nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in her throat. Tom was quiet for a long moment, studying her face. When he spoke again, his voice was gentle. "Daniel was a good man, honest trader, fair dealer. If he sent you here, then you're welcome at my table." The relief nearly buckled her knees. "Thank you. Come inside, Mrs. Crowfeather. You look like you could use a meal and a place to rest." The interior of the trading post was cool and dim, filled with the scents of leather and tobacco, coffee, and something that might have been hope. Tom's wife, Maria, emerged from the back room, a small, sturdy woman with gentle hands and eyes that missed nothing. "Dios mío," Maria breathed, taking in Sarah's condition. "Tom, get some food. This woman is half-starved." Within minutes, Sarah found herself seated at a rough wooden table with a bowl of stew that smelled like heaven and tasted even better. She forced herself to eat slowly, remembering the painful lesson of her first meal with Daniel, that a starving body needed to be coaxed back to life, not shocked into it. "How long since you've had a proper meal?" Maria asked, settling beside her with a cup of coffee. "Months," Sarah admitted, "since the wagon train was attacked outside Tucson." Tom and Maria exchanged glances. "That was you?" Tom said. "We heard about that. Thought everyone was killed." "Almost everyone was." Sarah stared into her coffee, seeing faces in the dark liquid. People she'd traveled with, laughed with. People who'd had dreams and plans and futures that ended in screams and smoke. "I ran, hid in the rocks until they were gone, then just kept running. And Daniel found you," Maria said softly. "He was dying, shot by cavalry in some skirmish, but he still—" Sarah's voice broke. "He gave me his food, his water, his name, everything he had left." "That sounds like Daniel," Tom said. "Never met a man with a bigger heart, Apache or otherwise." They let her eat in peace after that, understanding that some stories needed time to be told. When she'd finished, Maria led her to a small room behind the store, clean and simple, with a real bed and a window that looked out over the canyon. "Rest," Maria said. "Tomorrow we'll figure out what comes next." But sleep wouldn't come, despite her exhaustion. Sarah lay staring at the ceiling, thinking about the impossible journey that had brought her here. 3 days ago, she'd been Sarah Mitchell, a woman with no future and no hope. Now she was Sarah Crowfeather, carrying the name of a man who'd shown her that enemies could become friends, that strangers could become family. The next morning brought visitors, two Apache women who'd heard somehow that Daniel's wife had arrived at the trading post. Sarah's heart raced as they approached, wondering if they would see through her deception, if they would challenge her right to carry Daniel's name. The older woman spoke first, her English careful but clear. "I am Nahastzan. This is my daughter Desba. We knew Daniel Crowfeather." Sarah stood slowly, unsure of the protocol, unsure of anything. "I'm Sarah. We heard of his death," Nahastzan continued. "We come to honor his memory and to see the woman he chose." There was something in the way she said it that made Sarah's breath catch. Not accusation, exactly, but a kind of testing. These women knew something, understood something that she was only beginning to grasp. "He saved my life," Sarah said simply. "Yes," Nahastzan nodded. "This we know, but why did he give you his name?" The question hung in the air like smoke, and Sarah realized that this was more than curiosity. This was about belonging, about the weight of names and the responsibility they carried. "Because I was alone," Sarah said finally. "Because he was alone. Because in those last hours, we found something beyond the hatred between our peoples." Desba, who had been silent until now, stepped forward. "Show us his horse." They walked to where Ayana stood in the small corral behind the trading post. The moment the mare saw the Apache women, she nickered and came to the fence, pressing her nose against Nahastzan's outstretched hand. "She knows you," Sarah observed. "Daniel brought her here as a foal," Nahastzan explained. "I helped birth her. She is named for his sister." "He told me," Sarah said softly. "He said Ayana means eternal blossom." Something shifted in the older woman's expression. "You spoke of his family?" "He told me about his sister, how she taught children the old stories. He hoped she was safe." Nahastzan's eyes filled with tears. "Ayana was my daughter, Daniel's sister. She died in the cavalry attack." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Daniel had known. He'd known his sister was dead, and he'd still chosen hope over despair, still chosen to save a stranger rather than surrender to grief. "I'm sorry," Sarah whispered. "I'm so sorry." "Do not be sorry," Nahastzan said, wiping her eyes. "Be worthy. Daniel gave you more than his name. He gave you his hope that things could be different." Over the following days, Sarah began to understand what that meant. Nahastzan and Desba became her teachers, showing her the responsibilities that came with being Daniel's widow. It wasn't just about protection or belonging. It was about carrying forward his vision of a world where Apache and white could coexist. Daniel believed in bridges, Nahastzan explained as they sat by the fire one evening. He learned English, learned white ways, not to become white, but to build understanding. He thought maybe if enough people on both sides tried. "But the hatred is so strong," Sarah said. "On both sides." "Yes, but hatred is taught. It can be untaught." Desba spoke for the first time that evening, her voice young but certain. "Daniel proved this. You proved this." "I don't know how to be what he wanted me to be," Sarah admitted. "You already are," Nahastzan said simply. "You chose to see him as human when you could have seen only enemy. That is the beginning of all change." The trading post became a kind of sanctuary, a place where the rules of the outside world seemed suspended. Apache and white traders came and went, and while there was always tension, there was also something else, a grudging respect for the neutral ground Tom and Maria had created. Sarah found herself becoming part of that neutrality, a living bridge between worlds. Her presence seemed to ease conversations, to remind people that the lines they'd drawn weren't as solid as they'd believed. She was white, but she carried an Apache name. She'd been a victim of Apache raids, but she mourned an Apache warrior. She was living proof that the world was more complicated than the stories people told themselves. But the outside world had a way of intruding on even the safest sanctuaries. It came in the form of a cavalry patrol, dust-covered and grim-faced, led by a captain whose eyes held the kind of certainty that brooked no questions. "Ma'am," Captain Morrison said, touching his hat as he approached Sarah in the trading post, "I understand you're the survivor of the Tucson wagon train massacre." Sarah's blood turned to ice. "I am. We've been looking for you for months. There are people back east who've been worried sick." "What people?" Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer would complicate everything. "Your aunt in Philadelphia. She hired the Pinkerton agency to find you when word reached her about the attack. She's been sending money for your safe return." Sarah stared at him, her mind reeling. Aunt Margaret, her father's sister, a woman she'd met perhaps 3 times in her life, a woman who lived in a world of tea parties and social obligations, who would never understand what Sarah had become in the desert. "I see," Sarah said carefully. "We can escort you back to civilization, ma'am, get you cleaned up back to your family where you belong." The words hit her like a slap. Where she belonged. As if belonging was something that could be determined by blood or geography rather than choice and understanding. "This is very kind," Sarah said slowly, "but I'm not sure I'm ready to leave just yet." Captain Morrison's expression hardened slightly. "Ma'am, with respect, this is no place for a white woman. These people, they're not your people. These people saved my life," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the anger building in her chest. "I understand you might feel some misplaced gratitude, but there's nothing misplaced about it." Sarah stood, drawing herself up to her full height. "And I'll thank you not to speak about my friends in such a manner." The captain looked genuinely confused. "Friends? Ma'am, these are Apaches, the same people who killed your fellow travelers." "Some Apaches killed my fellow travelers," Sarah corrected. "These Apaches saved my life. Just as some white men would help a stranger in need, while others would rob them blind. People are individuals, Captain, not just members of tribes or races." "Ma'am, I think the trauma of your experience may have affected your judgment." "My judgment is perfectly clear," Sarah interrupted. "Clearer than it's ever been." The confrontation might have escalated, but Tom Brennan stepped between them, his presence calm but unmistakably protective. "Captain," he said mildly, "Mrs. Crowfeather is welcome to stay here as long as she likes. This is neutral ground, and she's under my protection." "Mrs. Crowfeather?" The captain's eyes narrowed. "I was told her name was Mitchell." "People change," Tom said simply. "Names change. Circumstances change." Sarah could see the captain processing this information, could almost watch him putting together the pieces. A white woman with an Apache name, living at a trading post that catered to both sides of the conflict. It was exactly the kind of situation that military minds were trained to see as problematic. "Ma'am," the captain said finally, his voice carefully controlled, "I'm going to ask you directly. Have you been coerced in any way? Forced to take that name?" The question was so absurd that Sarah almost laughed. "No, Captain. I chose it freely." "You chose to take an Apache name?" "I chose to honor a man who saved my life. A man who showed me that the world doesn't have to be divided into us and them." The captain was quiet for a long moment, studying her face as if trying to read a map written in a foreign language. When he spoke again, his voice was softer, but no less troubled. "Ma'am, I've been fighting Apaches for 5 years. I've seen what they do to white settlers, to families. How can you stand there and defend them?" "I'm not defending raids or violence," Sarah said. "I'm defending the right of individuals to be judged as individuals. The man who gave me his name was dying when I found him. He could have taken what little I had and left me to die. Instead, he shared his food, his water, his protection. He chose compassion over conquest. One man doesn't represent an entire people." "Exactly," Sarah said. "One man doesn't represent an entire people. Not Apache, not white, not anyone. That's the point." The captain left that afternoon, but not before making it clear that Sarah's choice to stay would be reported to his superiors. There would be questions, he warned, about a white woman living among Apaches, about the loyalty of someone who chose an Apache name over her birth name. "Let them ask their questions," Sarah told Tom after the patrol had gone. "I know who I am now." But the visit had shaken something loose, had forced her to confront the reality of her situation. She couldn't stay at the trading post forever, couldn't hide from the world behind Tom and Maria's protection. Eventually, she would have to decide what kind of life she wanted to build with the name Daniel had given her. The answer came from an unexpected source. Desba approached her one evening as she sat watching the sunset paint the canyon walls in shades of gold and crimson. "There is something I must tell you," the young woman said, settling beside her on the wooden bench outside the trading post. "What is it?" "There are children, Apache children, whose parents were killed in the raids, the attacks. They have no one to teach them English, to help them understand the white world they must now navigate." Sarah turned to look at her. "You want me to teach them?" Daniel believed that understanding was the path to peace. These children, they are the future. If they can learn to walk in both worlds, maybe they can build the bridges Daniel dreamed of. The idea took root in Sarah's mind, like a seed finding fertile ground. Teaching. It was what she'd done before, what she'd loved before the world turned upside down. But this would be different. This would be teaching not just reading and writing, but understanding. Not just facts, but hope. "Where are these children?" she asked. "Some are here, with families who survived. Others are at the reservation, but they could come here for lessons. Tom and Maria have agreed to let you use the back room." Sarah thought of Daniel, of his sister Ayana, who had taught children the old stories. Maybe this was how she could honor both of them, by teaching new stories, stories of possibility and understanding. "Yes," she said, "yes, I'll do it." The first students arrived the following week, 6 children ranging in age from 7 to 14, their eyes holding the wariness of those who had learned too young that the world was not a safe place. Sarah looked at them and saw herself as she'd been in the desert, lost, afraid but not yet broken. "My name is Sarah Crow Feather," she told them in the mixture of English and Apache she was slowly learning. "I'm here to teach you, but I hope you'll teach me too." The oldest boy, perhaps 13, spoke up. "You are white. Why do you have Apache name?" It was the question she'd been expecting, the one that would determine whether these children would trust her enough to learn from her. "Because a good man gave it to me," she said simply. "An Apache man who saved my life and showed me that people are more than the color of their skin or the tribe they're born into." "What man?" asked a girl with braids and serious eyes. "Daniel Crow Feather. He was Nahas Zan's nephew." The children exchanged glances, and Sarah could see recognition in their faces. Daniel's name carried weight here, respect that extended to her by association. "He is dead?" the boy asked. "Yes, but his hope isn't dead. His dream of a world where Apache and white can understand each other, that's still alive." And so began the strangest school Sarah had ever taught. In the mornings, she taught English and arithmetic, geography and history. But in the afternoons, the children taught her Apache words and customs, stories and songs, ways of seeing the world that were entirely new to her. She learned that the Apache word for teacher was the same as the word for one who plants seeds. She learned that in Apache culture names were earned, not just given, and that by taking Daniel's name, she had accepted the responsibility to live up to its meaning. Most importantly, she learned that healing was possible. Not the forgetting kind of healing that pretended wounds had never existed, but the growing kind that acknowledged pain while choosing hope. The children began to change, and so did she. Their wariness gave way to curiosity, their fear to cautious trust. They began to see her not as a white woman pretending to be Apache, but as something new, a bridge person, someone who belonged to both worlds and neither. Word of the school spread, and more children came. Some white children too, the sons and daughters of traders and settlers who wanted their children to understand the land they lived in and the people who had lived there first. It wasn't always easy. There were parents on both sides who objected, who saw the mixing of cultures as dangerous or wrong. There were officials who questioned Sarah's methods, her loyalty, her right to teach Apache children. But Tom and Maria stood behind her, and gradually the community that grew around the trading post began to see the value in what she was doing. One evening, as Sarah was cleaning up after a particularly successful lesson, Nahastzan appeared in the doorway. "You have done well," the older woman said. "Daniel would be proud." "I hope so," Sarah replied. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm doing enough, if I'm worthy of the name he gave me." "Names are not about being worthy," Nahastzan said. "They are about becoming worthy. Every day you choose to honor Daniel's memory. Every day you plant seeds of understanding. That is enough." As autumn turned to winter, Sarah realized that she had found something she hadn't even known she was looking for, a purpose that went beyond mere survival. She was no longer the woman who had fled into the desert, broken and alone. She was Sarah Crow Feather, teacher and bridge builder, keeper of a dead man's dream. The children were thriving, becoming fluent in both languages, comfortable in both worlds. Some of the older ones had begun to serve as translators when disputes arose between Apache and white traders. They were becoming exactly what Daniel had envisioned, living bridges between two peoples who had forgotten how to see each other as human. But perhaps the greatest change was in Sarah herself. She had learned to carry grief without being crushed by it, to honor the dead while serving the living. She had discovered that identity was not something fixed and unchangeable, but something that could be chosen and shaped by acts of courage and compassion. On the anniversary of Daniel's death, she rode Ayana back to the canyon where it had all begun. The grave was still there, marked by stones that had weathered but not fallen. She knelt beside it and spoke to the wind, telling Daniel about the children, about the school, about the small but growing community of people who believed in his vision. "I don't know if this is what you intended," she said to the silent stones, "but it's what grew from the seed you planted. Thank you for giving me your name. Thank you for showing me that enemies can become friends, that strangers can become family." The wind carried her words away across the desert, and for a moment she could almost hear his voice in return. "We saved each other." As she rode back toward the trading post, toward the life she had built from the ashes of the old one, Sarah Crow Feather smiled. She had been a woman who weighed less than a saddlebag, hollow with hunger and despair. Now she was full, not just with food, but with purpose, with belonging, with the knowledge that she was exactly where she was meant to be. The desert stretched endlessly around her, but she was no longer afraid of its vastness. She had learned that home was not a place, but a choice, that family was not just blood, but bonds forged in understanding and respect. She had learned that sometimes the greatest gift you could give someone was simply to see them as human. And in a small trading post at Canyon de Chelly, Apache and white children learned together, played together, grew together, living proof that Daniel Crow Feather's dream was not just possible, but real. Hey, my friends, help me by subscribing to the channel so we can reach 1,000 subscribers, even if you're watching from your TV or computer. Your subscription makes all the difference, and the algorithm will help you see more amazing stories. Leave a like or an emoji in the comments and be part of this growth.